Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us from wherever you are. I'm happy to welcome you today to our session on exploring effective advocacy across the education ecosystem and what works well for social emotional learning. We understand that a lot of you are joining us from around the world. So for many, it might be dinner time or even bedtime. So thank you especially for making the time to keep us company and join us in what we hope is a productive conversation. I will now share my screen. So hopefully that works well. All right. So our goal for today is to discuss with your support what effective advocacy looks like in different relationships across the educational ecosystem. So not just in the usual direction that we tend to think of civil society towards government, but also in relationship with other actors and stakeholders within the educational ecosystem, and what might be some connecting principles that could help in the future align better advocacy strategies. Our team today is made of 4 present team members and 1 that sadly couldn't join us today. We have Asma Al-Khatib, Senior ECD Project Manager working at Plan International in Jordan. Wafa Nasser, who is in charge of psychosocial support and a health program manager for Ana Accra Association in Lebanon. Mr. Fadi Yarak, General Director of Education and Interim Director of General Higher Education at the Ministry of Education and Higher Education in Lebanon. And myself, Carolina Casas, Senior Director of Education and Research for Sesame Workshop in Latin America. The work that we'll conduct today was greatly informed by our colleague, Julia Finder-Jonah, who is a Senior Advisor on Education and Crisis and Conflict for USAID and is based in the United States. So we have an exciting new format for our meeting today. The first half of our session will be an interview with our colleague Fadi. We're going to be, in lieu of a presentation, we thought we could explore how effective advocacy could look like from the perspective of different relationships. So Mr. Fadi Yarak will serve as an interviewee and answer some questions from various stakeholders from the perspective of a Ministry of Education official. The remaining members of our team will take on the role of a particular stakeholder with whom we're familiar to base their questions. If you yourselves have questions that you would like to ask Mr. Yarak as a government official, please write them in the chat and we'll do our best to get to them. Luckily, we're a manageable size of group today, so we might be able to get to all your questions. So first up, our colleague Wafa Nasser will take on the role of a school official. Wafa, welcome. Fadi, welcome as well. Fadi, you will have about 4 minutes to answer each question. So let me hand it over to Wafa.
Thank you, Carolina, thank you. Hello, Mr. Fadi again. Mr. Fadi, my first question is, I am, as you know, representing the school officials and school principals in our country. So my question to you is, how can we as school officials and principals play a strong and effective role when advocating for SEL integration in our schools? And how can we make our voices heard in that sense? So I hope you can give me a good answer.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone, or good morning, everyone. It depends on the time zone. Thank you, Wafa. Thank you for this question. It's very important. At the end, school officials or school principals are the local leaders. They are really the ones who do the real change on the field. They are leading the school community. They are in contact, regular contacts with parents, with the community, local community. They are managing and working hand by hand with the teachers, with the administrative staff. So any policy that is being planned or put on the macro level, at central level, at ministries or federal level, it depends on the country, it is implemented at school at the end. So if they are, I would say, the guardian of the temple, they are the people who relay the messages and try to translate it and adapt it to the local context. So they are very important. They have a very important role, and the work is to be done with the school principals, with the school leaders, to get informed and sensitized about the importance of SEL, of the social and emotional learning. They work with learners. They are in direct contact with learners. So they need to be aware of the importance of and the impact of social and emotional learning on the students at the end. And they need to create the best environment to promote this culture. And this is very, very important. Without them, no change can be done. So whatever the best policy, it needs to be translated. It comes from down up and from up down. And this is very important when it comes from them, the feedback, when it comes from them, how the adaptability of any policy. I think this is important to see first how much they are aware, they are trained, and it's part of their job description to include ideas mainly in pandemic and post-pandemic and the recovery period, the SEL. It is an important. And mainly when we are talking, and here we are a group of people who are working with or dealing with children in difficult circumstances or vulnerable population or children who are coming from displacement or refugees. So the dimension of SEL or initiatives like PSS, what do you do yourself? And now it's more and more intersectorial. We need to, the mental health, the health awareness and the learning, because this will create stability in such period of recovery, mainly from post-pandemic, pandemic and post-pandemic, but also from other crises. It depends on the context. I mean, in the case of Lebanon, we have multi-layer of crisis, from financial to economic to political instability, and the impact of the Syrian crisis on the displacement. All these factors affect the learners. And we are now talking about learning loss. So SEL is an important dimension to create stability and to work on recovery. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Riari. Yeah, very true. Thank you. One question, another question that comes to us is like, as you know as well, there are several new SEL initiatives in the country, and several new approaches as well. So how can we decide or understand which approach would work best for our schools and communities? This is a little bit confusing for us at the moment.
It's important what you're saying, but it depends here on the education system. It depends on the size of the country. If it is a centralized system where one approach is accepted by us as government, or if we give the flexibility. In case of Lebanon, any program or initiative should be studied, the material, the curricula, or the content by a specialized center that approves or gives no objection on the content. But at the end, the teachers, they have a major role about the flexibility, because also there is a local cultural context. And this is very important. The approach is very, very important. And here is, I mean, the general lines should be accepted, general framework accepted, but teachers have an important role. First, to understand, live it, but also to know how to deal with learners when we talk about SEL. And a lot of approaches are now talking horizontally. I mean, it goes with different thematic subject matters. We have more and more approaches not to deal with it as a separate, I mean, now let's go and work on SEL. No, it could be a part of the education culture, a part of the learning process. And this is another approach, that sometimes being this child is a center in this, and being the well-being of the child is important. So learners should live in a stable environment that can get what he or she needs to continue his education or her education, and to overcome what I said, the learning losses. SEL should be, and its approaches to facilitate and reduce the gap of these losses. Mainly we're talking about children coming from difficult circumstances, from displacement, or children that were affected by the pandemic and other crises like displacement.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Maybe my colleague, Carolina, you want to get this now? Thank you.
Wafa, and thank you, Fadi. Now let's hear from the perspective of civil society. My colleague Asma Al-Khatib will be asking her questions from the point of view of non-governmental organizations. Asma, there's also a question in the chat that might be relevant to your stakeholder perspective. So I invite you to take a look and see whether that can be kind of infused into your questions, but please go ahead.
Thank you, Carolina. Hello, Mr. Fadi. I am Asma Al-Khatib. I'm working with an international organization. And thank you for giving us this opportunity to hear from Ministry of Education work and experience. I have two questions for you. The first one is about, is the government give the priorities for social emotional learning in the plans that they put, and how you are ensuring the long-term sustainability for that?
Thank you very much. You know, to put social and emotional learning in the priorities and the plans, first it needs to be government officials, ourselves. We need to understand it, convinced with it, but also follow the need. Not also convinced and understand it. Follow the need. More and more, there is evidence-based that there is a need to introduce SEL and SEL approaches in the learning process, in the schools, in the with the I would say education community as a whole, or family. So for this, I will give the example of Lebanon. SEL is related to two priorities in our 5 years plan. First, it shows, and evidence shows, that with SEL approaches, it helps in retention, but also it participates in quality education. So the two pillars, two of three pillars of the education plan in Lebanon are having or have the SEL dimension. The equity, the participation, the accessibility is important, which is a pillar one, but within this is the retention and keeping children in the education system. And SEL, and there is evidence from the different initiatives in the world, from the different best practices, that SEL contributes to enhance the retention and give equity, because every child will feel, the child with need, the child with coming from a challenged socioeconomic background or others, they have the same chance to continue. SEL contributes on this. Second is the quality education. And quality education, when we say quality, This means you have in it the teacher's role, the principal roles, but also make sure that all the protection, the mental health, the psychosocial approach. And we're talking about vulnerable children. We're talking about children in a normal situation that's are living now in a 2 years pandemic and its effects. So this is the normal situation. We have 2 years of pandemic effect, but we are witnessing, and part of the group are living with children coming from different crises, refugees, children with special needs, children who has witnessed some violence. So all this dimension, SEL contributes to quality, contributes to make sure that child continue with their needs to the end. And this is important also.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fadi. And I have another question about how you are ensuring the alignment of SEL initiatives and implementation practices between the government and the NGO sector, and what level of coordination and collaboration is expected?
It's very important. I mean, without coordination, everyone would do whatever he wants. I mean, I think to keep the momentum of quality education and to keep getting clear indicators of results, coordination is very important. And involving people with responsibility. So everyone, I mean the stakeholders needs to intervene with their best knowledge. And this is very important on this level. It depends on the country. You have some countries where you have a cluster approach, others they have coordination mechanism. In our case, we have two levels of coordination. We have a thematic coordination group, which is a committee that does on 3 phases: the content, the piloting and the implementation, and the monitoring. But also we have another working group of the stakeholders. So you have internal and following up the implementation, but also with the different stakeholders, NGOs, donors, and multilateral and bilateral, UN agencies, etc. Because they are working with NGOs, but they are also pushing certain agendas or certain priority or certain approach. So coordination is very important in larger scale and in a small scale.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fadi. Over to you, Carolina. I think the question, it's very excited to ask the question in the chat, and I think we need to give the time more to answer the question, because it's speak about the best practices, and we will go more in depth in the second session on the best practices, but also we can go after all the question on the chat question. Over to you, Carolina.
Well, let me ask this question because I think is very important, from Hilba, I believe.
Yeah. Hilba.
Hilba asks us, when it comes to advocacy, what is the most effective way to really persuade or influence government officials? In your personal experience, what has been the best approach?
Evidence-based. Data and evidence-based, I think, and a realistic approach. You know, the big challenge is when there is competition about approaches. I mean, government officials will can be lost if you have 5 NGOs or 2-3 donors coming with the same agenda on the SEL, and everyone has a different approach, and everyone say, I am coming to my model lived somewhere else, and you want nothing, no copy paste. I mean, recipe works. Usually adaptability is the best. Let's be realistic, and the size. I mean, at the end, hundreds of pilots are nice, but what will be the impact? What we need is impact at the end. So to get pursued, to understand, to push such agenda, evidence-based, adaptability, and I mean, from the beginning, trying to convince with, look, this is the result. This is what happened. I mean, your case, I mean, your Sesame case is by itself. I mean, the methodology is by itself. We saw previously the children, how they were amazed by the model. At the end, what do we want? We want the child to get the education needed, to continue in school and be a life learner and get the quality education. Not one child, every child, regardless of the nationality, of the economic, of the social background, and also of the status. So this is very important. We need to think about a child, regardless of the gender, of the status again, and make them love, continue, and get whatever they can from this period of their formal education. And I believe formal education is important. I mean, it is protection. They need to see children, parents, community, that school is a safe place. School is a place where child can give, can create, can get, I mean, live his childhood, his youth period, and become a responsible citizen later.
Great, thank you so much. So we're hearing evidence-based, realistic, adaptable, scalable, and aligned with government principles and priorities.
Priorities.
Wonderful. So now let me ask you a few questions from the perspective of parents and caregivers. You know, families are constantly being asked to act differently, to do things differently when it comes to supporting children's social emotional well-being. When do families come to the table? I mean,
at the end, they are the voices of the children, somehow. I mean, they are, I mean, families are the parents. And they are not only the group who are negotiating and pushing for tuition fees, or just want more time in schools because they are busy with their professional lives, or they are not interested. I think families are really the counterpart of the ministries somehow. They are, I mean, they represent the nucleus group, if the government represents the bigger group, which is the larger number of students. So at the end, it is very important that they feel secure that the children are getting the best in their learning journey. And this is very important. How? By continuing the negotiation with the school principals, by following closely with the teachers, by working with supervisors, by mobilizing resources to the schools, by having an important role on the boards of the schools, by raising their voices towards policies, by making us listen to their voice and understand their need, and push their representatives, members of parliaments, parties, political figures, community leaders, toward their agenda. At the end, the agenda should be the agenda of the children.
Thank you so much. I think you actually answered my following question. So I'm going to pick one up from the chat. From Rose Cardarelli. What are your suggestions in terms, or I would add best practices that you've observed in your line of work to promote teachers' social emotional well-being. Sometimes the emotional state of teachers affects learners as well. They seem overwhelmed and overworked around the world. So what strategies are you aware of that you could share with the group?
As I mentioned before, and at the end, and the pillar 2, quality, who ensures the quality education? Teachers. Teachers are the real game changer. They are the one who convey the message. Their well-being is as important as the learners. Well-being on all levels, social well-being, economic well-being, and definitely working conditions. I mean, no one knows at the end what happens in this closed, I would say, box, which is the classroom. They are the role model of our children. So teachers have an important role. And that's how not only initial training, continuous training, motivate children, motivate teachers, getting them exposed to new technology, to new methodology. Teachers were affected a lot by the pandemic. I mean, in a lot of countries, in my country also, they had a fast transition from the face-to-face, from the in-person teaching to the online and the different technologies. It was not easy. I mean, they were also confined. They were staying at home. They were under pressure from the pandemic, and they are dealing with difficult circumstances, as well dealing with a diversity of students, and it's not easy. I mean, you know, when a teacher are working with in a bilingualism or multilingualism environment, need to work with children who are monolingualism, or with students who are affected by traumas. Not easy. I mean, if I'm a subject matter, I need also to be exposed to ways of how to deal with a child. So their well-being is important. Their healing is important. Their I would say, ideally, to be part of their professionalism of the teaching profession. So teachers have a key role in transforming lives.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I'm going to now transition to my colleague Asma, who will take us through the instructions for our second half of this session. Thank you so much, Fadi and Wafa and Asma as well for your contributions to this first half, as well as to the participants that introduced some questions in the chat. So Asma?
Thank you, Carolina. Just we have the last question in the chat. It's written now. It's about for Mr. Fadi. The last question, Mr. Fadi, about in current situation, especially with COVID-19, what are the most effective methods of advocacy? Is there any huge difference in this regard? This is from Serene Aburman.
Thank you, Serene, and thank you for the question. I think sometimes, and I'm going to be realistic a bit, also you have some topics that raise with time. And now with the corona and the pandemic, you have some issues are on the surface. So definitely the donors' agenda with their topics are important. And they are, I think, an important factor of advocacy, but also the local groups, the political environment in a country, and the topics by itself. What we need to do is a diversity of advocacy tools. to put the agenda forward, and mainly when we know that issues like this, social and emotional learning, has an important impact on the learners, has an important impact on retaining the students in the education system, on ensuring or participating or contributing to ensure on their journey in education and successfully journey of education, and making them happy. I mean, the well-being is important.
Thank you, Mr. Fadi, for your input and for your sharing the experience. Now we'll move to the next session, which we will hear from you about your experience and your thought and your perspective about the SEL in general. In this session, we aim to hear more from you on the challenges that affect the advocacy around the SEL, and on other hand, we need to hear what does successful SEL advocacy look like with examples from different perspectives. Our plan is to have breakout rooms and to divide it into groups, but we think that because the number for the group is 16, so we can have general discussion here to know about the SEL, the challenges and the best practices from different perspectives. The perspective is, as Carolina said before, government perspective, non-governmental organizations, and educator and school officials, parents and caregivers. So maybe we can have each one and to discuss the challenges that affect the advocacy around SEL, and then we can discuss the successful SEL advocacy. What is the successful SEL advocacy look like? Yes, this is the highlighted one. So feel free to unmute yourself to answer and to speak about the challenges and the successful in general. So we can start it with the government part, and we have here benefited from Mr. Fadi experience here. Yes, you can find the question in the chat. So unmute yourself and tell us more about your experience, your thought, your perspective about the challenges and the successful.
So I just have one question. So now we're picking the government, the government perspective, and we're going to answer these questions for the government, right?
Right.
Yes.
Okay. So I think one of the challenges to have an effective advocacy around social emotional learning is the pressure that the government staff have, and they have a lot of workload that sometimes it prevents them to apply the social emotional learning, and it might be the experience of the governmental staff that in the case of Jordan, for example, we have the governmental staff. In some of the cases, they are somehow old, and they it's not necessarily that they have an updated education and workshops and trainings. So it can be reflected, or it can be turned out into a successful SEL advocacy by building the capacity of those governmental staff, so they, when they understand the quality and the social emotional learning and the importance of having the social emotional learning within, for example, the education and health, etc. In all sectors, it can be the buy-in for the governmental staff might be higher than other service providers, as they always and in a daily dealing with children and other partners and stakeholders. So this point can be in both as a challenge and as a successful, but it depends on the NGOs and the INGOs and building the capacity of the staff. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruba. And also we have here Wafa.
Yes, I just wanted to build on what's your name? Sorry, what's her name that was
Ruba.
speaking?
Ruba.
Yes. I think, Ruba, you said that one of the challenges is the understanding of the importance first. Is that from, and I would say this would be a challenge across, it would be at the level of school officials and as principals or as, let's say, teachers, communities, parents as well. Maybe some organizations would understand the importance of that, but I think that to really have a good advocacy, one of the biggest challenges really the understanding is still of the importance of SEL and how SEL can really impact and improve well-being of students and academics as well, So I think that this understanding and the knowing of SEL is the biggest challenge across.
Thank you, Wafa. Thank you for your input. And we have also Dominique. Please go ahead.
Am I next, Asma? I think I was after Hilba.
I don't know. I missed the.
And possibly after
Yeah.
Carolina as well.
Carolina, yes, I missed the who's before. Yeah.
That's
Carolina?
okay. You can. I'm
Yeah.
happy to let you go first.
Yeah.
So my question was really around clarity of social and emotional learning and whether this was a problem with advocacy for it, that the phrase is used to cover so many different things that it sort of, there's a risk sometimes that it ends up being meaningless. And if we're advocating for it, do you feel that we need more precision around the definition and that would help with the advocacy?
You're asking, who are you asking?
I'm asking the panel
In general.
generally, asking all of
Yeah.
you, maybe
Oh,
start with Fadi and
yeah.
then
Yeah.
Yes, please, Mr. Fadi, go ahead.
I think there is Hiba before me, and then I will.
Yes. There is Hiba and Carolina.
No, it's fine. I was going to ask a question, so if it's fine for you to answer this one, and then I'll ask my question. Thank you.
Fadi, I was just saying, from your perspective, when people,
I think at the end, in the government or in the public institutions, there is two types of people working on issues like this. You have the technical people who would understand the content of the material, the resources related to SEL in general, more specifically certain things. And you have the administrative, the management people, that they are at the end who sometimes take a decision based on the recommendation of the technical. So these both entities, they need to understand what it is about SEL. And in everyone in his or her languages, it means in her language. So yes, I fully agree with you that precision of what is now SEL, the definition and what englobes, because a recovery from protection part was part of the SEL. Healing is something, or a PSS could be. So this new approach of talking, a lot of people talking about SEL, I think we should, all of us in the panel here, in the environment, from a school teachers, school principal, to a policymaker, they should have as somehow the same reading of things. So I fully agree with you on or precision or clarification.
Thank you, Mr. Fadi. And Carolina?
Yeah, I'd like to add that from the advocacy work that we're doing in this space, it's become quickly evident that a lot of the advocacy efforts are about specific programs rather than approaches that government can take on. And that's very challenging when you're just advocating for program A or program B, and which is most of the times they're inherently unscalable. You know, like you can actually have a contained program as originally designed and tested in just specific locations. So just the fact that a lot of the evidence and the thinking is not being thought in terms of what a government can do, I find that can be problematic. But I also think that there is lack of alignment on the side of like civil society organizations, academic institutions, in terms of what are those things that concretely that we would like to see governments implement. So yes, it goes through the specificity of some of the approaches, but just kind of coordination on our side. So we're not kind of cannibalizing advocacy efforts, but being actually very systematic in terms of the types of gains that we would hope to see materialize.
Thank you, Carolina, and I agreed with you because it's very, the meaning of SEL, it's very broad, and I think the understanding of it and the recognition of what is exactly meaning and what is the sector and what is the areas that we need to integrate it on, it's very difficult to have for a lot, not just the government, also for other sector, for government and for non-government organization to understand the importance. So we think that, and this is the discussion in our organization and in today morning, because we saw that we need to have a clear understanding for that before having the advocacy from different organizations to have to unify our understanding, so we can go on the process together, not just the government alone or the civil society alone. So we need to have this joint effort between all, and this to unify the understanding and to have definition for the SEL, and so I think the advocacy will be more and will be effective in this case. So Hiba.
Thank you, Esma. I really found what you just said now interesting, and as well, a lot of the things that were said before quite interesting. I think it cuts across with some of the points that I kind of want to make, and it's not really a challenge per se or an answer, but it's maybe more food for thought that builds on what was said, and specifically just with Caroline and what she was mentioning about being more specific. I think that not just with SEL, but I think in general, when we work in this field and we're very passionate about a certain topic, sometimes we can get too deep and not really realize that when you want to advocate specific to government officials, when they have their hands full and they have a lot of competing priorities, it's really important to really break it down to the base level. So basically have a few top priorities that you really want to address, as opposed to sometimes pitching everything that you want done within the sector, which can sometimes overwhelm officials and will make it harder for you to process change. Because when they have to deal with something large, it's very hard to push those through. But if you can basically break it down into small chunks, it helps them, first of all, open a wedge into whatever issue you really want to open into, and also helps build the bridge for you to then create other change. And I think this is also something else that Fadi mentioned as well when he was speaking, is the collaboration aspect. So I think it's very, very important that when we're working within this sector that we really do coordinate and collaborate. And as Esma was mentioning now, that was one of the discussions they had earlier in the day, when you're collaborating and basically bringing all the efforts together of all the INGOs who operate in the field to make sure you all agree on some key messages, top 3 key messages, and then it's just a case of hammering that message home. It's repeating it, speaking to different officials, but once the language is unified, it helps stick in government officials' mind, and it also helps make the issue easier to digest, because you don't want to cause any more confusion within the dialogue when you're really advocating for a case. So for me, I think those are some of the most important things. I just kind of wanted to highlight that as well and kind of build on some of the previous comments. So thank you so much, Esma, and for all the panel hosts as well.
Thank you, Hiba, very much for your inputs. Yes, the coordination is key for to have effective advocacy. So, Mr. Fadi, and also Wafa, this is old hand or?
Actually, it was an old
No?
hand, but I kept it because I have one more thing to add.
Yeah.
If I have time, if no, I want to give it to someone else if I don't have the time. Don't worry. If
Maybe
there
we
is
can.
no time, Mr. Fadi, you wanted to say something?
Actually, I want to thank Hiba, and I'd like her to introduce herself because she was very focused on something, and I think she's right on what she said. I fully endorse what her intervention. I mean, maybe we know better what she does because she was very clear on putting priorities.
Thank you very much. I'm actually a policy advocacy and influencing manager at Plan International Jordan. So this is what I do on a day-to-day basis. So that's why I'm very passionate about it. And,
Thank you.
and that's why I was able to break it down that way.
Now we see that Asma did her homework and shared in her community.
Asma always does her homework.
Yeah, I wanted to add something that I feel it's very important. When we were talking about SEL, understanding of SEL, I think it's very important also to reinforce that it's more an approach, because SEL, it's a daily thing. It should not be something separated from the education in general. I think it's a way of teaching, of living, of educating children. And having said that, I mean that probably, and I'm sure there are many schools and many countries that in their educational system, they are doing SEL, they are following social and emotional learning objectives and on their daily practices, and they just probably don't know this could be the SEL. And so
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that because I know of many poor countries even, and poor communities that they do work and teach with SEL integrated, and they don't know that this is SEL.
So
I just wanted
the message of Dominique was very right in this dimension, because he is what is somehow what is, to be precise, what is SEL?
Yeah. Yes.
Exactly.
What includes, I would say. Not, I mean,
Yeah. So I think we have the last hand for
again.
Yes, but I think we have just the 3 minutes for the all sectors. But Catherine, do you want to say something, because I saw your hand? So if you have,
yeah, I mean, I was I've been thinking, as everyone's been talking about this, there's evidence and there's impact and proving those kind of things, but then there's also a really important element around kind of alignment, and as we kind of, you know, about the vision and the purpose of education and what role SEL plays in that. And there's a couple of really good reports that I've been reading recently, one from Big Change on a new education story, and one from Dream a Dream, which is called The Secret Sauce for Transforming Education Systems. And what they both have in common is this focus on kind of having that conversation with stakeholders. So, you know, with families, with NGOs, with teachers around like what's the purpose of education. And often they thanks Dominic for posting them in the chat there, but you know, often that they won't say, oh, it's to pass exams, you know, they won't say it's to get certificates at the end. They'll say, oh, I want my child to be a well-rounded person, you know. And that's where actually the importance of like starting that conversation is so important, but it's so often missed because you know, because policy makers are often focusing on what's the next, you know, next thing I have to do and the next thing to achieve, and actually stepping back and reflecting on that is quite a luxury in the fast moving world of government. So that was just something I was kind of reflecting on, and that, you know, as much as we have the evidence, actually you know, in terms of moving the window of policy, we call it Overton window in policy studies, but, you know, moving that window of like what's acceptable to talk about and what policies it's acceptable to make, sometimes having those conversations about purpose are just what you need to do that. There's not a question, sorry, it was just a kind of reflection.
Thank you for your reflection. It's very important, and we saw a lot of reports on the chat. Thank you, Dominique, for sharing this. I think we have just 5 minutes to discuss the areas. The rest of the areas, which is non-governmental organization, educator or school officials, and parents, caregivers. So maybe we can, if you have any reflection on each sector, on each areas, to reflect and to answer the question, which is on the chat, about the challenges, about the best practices, or how the SEL will be successful, it will be great. We have, I think, 5 to 6 minutes, so we can have a general reflection on this area.
Well,
Just unmuted yourself, yeah.
In our experience, both with educators and with families, the critical strategy really is to listen to them. I find that both stakeholder groups are kind of on the receiving end of a lot of advocacy efforts, but not necessarily heard and being seen as active participants in the conversation. So any structure that supports amplifying their voices and understanding their potential, and not just, whatever they might be lacking given the circumstances, is likely to have a more powerful effect.
Thank you, Carolina, very much. It's very important to hear and to put them participate in the education process because it's for them at the end. Is there any addition? Anyone want to see something or to have reflection? If you have any comments or any question, I think Carolina, or they can send it to us in the email, to Corina, or to one of the teams. I think we don't have a lot of time, so I will go over to Carolina to have the conclusion and to give us the ending of the session. Over to you, Carolina.
Well, I don't think there is that much more to say that hasn't been said already. I think one thing that really came across in this conversation is that we're all very passionate about the SEL and very passionate about building more productive relationships with other members of the education ecosystem to really kind of kindle the power of SEL to really transform learning experiences for children around the world, especially those that are being kind of more marginalized and affected by adversity. So I want to thank everyone, especially Mr. Fadi, for being kind of on the receiving end of a lot of our questions as our government representative, but also a lot of gratitude to the rest of my colleagues in this team, Asma, Wafa, also Julie, who couldn't be here, and to the Salzburg team for convening this group. I realized that this was kind of an exercise in team building, and I'm hoping that the conversations that we started today carry on in different platforms. So thank you so much. I hope everyone has a good rest of your day or evening, and we look forward to staying in touch.